At the dawn of July 16, 1945, in the barren expanse of the Jornada del Muerto desert in New Mexico, a cloud of fire and smoke rose to touch the sky, announcing the success of the Trinity test and ushering humanity into a new era of technological terror. But behind the scenes, in the corridors of the Pentagon and the White House, this explosion did not signal the inevitable end of the war. Rather, it was merely one card in a massive file heavy with blood. In that decisive moment of history, President Harry Truman and his generals were staring at a map of the Pacific, specifically towards the Japanese archipelago, realizing a terrifying truth. The Japanese Empire, despite losing its naval fleet and seeing its cities burn, showed no sign of surrender. Instead, it was reorganizing itself to fight the final battle, a battle designed to be the graveyard of invaders. Here emerged the alternative plan that would have been executed had the nuclear gamble failed, a plan that bore the code name Operation Downfall. It was to be the largest amphibious invasion in human history, aiming to storm the Japanese home islands with overwhelming military force, crushing Japanese resistance house by house and room by room, in a scenario that strategic analysts estimated would cost the United States more than 1 million casualties and wipe the Japanese nation out of existence, both demographically and culturally. To understand the sheer scale of the bloodbath that was looming, we must first dissect the mindset of the opponent Washington was preparing to face. Japan in the summer of 1945 was not a state in the traditional sense, but had transformed into a fortress governed by an unyielding Bushido mentality. Military leaders in Tokyo realized that military victory was impossible, but they believed they could force a bloody stalemate. Their strategy, which they dubbed Ketsu-Go, or the decisive operation, was simple yet terrifying. To inflict such massive, intolerable losses on the invading American forces in the first days of the landing, that the war-weary American public would demand a halt to the fighting and a negotiation of terms that would preserve the imperial system. To achieve this, the Japanese army did not merely mobilize what remained of its regular forces, numbering nearly 1 million soldiers in the southern islands, but activated the National Mobilization Law, effectively erasing the line between soldier and civilian. Every male from 15 to 60 and every female from 17 to 40 was conscripted into the Volunteer Fighting Corps. School children were trained to attack tanks with Molotov cocktails, and women were drilled to thrust sharpened bamboo spears toward the liver and eyes, in a surreal scene turning an entire population into an army of desperate defenders. The instructions issued by General Command were clear and strict. Do not surrender, and use anything available to kill, from ancient swords to farming tools. Thus, American soldiers were about to face a psychological nightmare they had never experienced in Europe, where the opponent was not a soldier in a distinguishable uniform, but a girl in a school uniform or an old man in traditional robes, making every movement and every shadow a source of potential death. On the other side of the ocean, the American military machine was massing its forces for the appointed day, nicknamed X-Day, specifically November 1st, 1945, the scheduled date for the start of the first phase of the invasion under the name Operation Olympic. The goal was to seize the southern third of Kyushu Island, to convert it into a massive airbase and harbor, allowing for the launch of the second phase toward Tokyo. To accomplish this impossible mission, the United States assembled a naval armada consisting of thousands of ships, including 42 aircraft carriers and 24 battleships, to transport the Sixth Army, comprised of hundreds of thousands of Marines and soldiers. However, what the American command in Washington did not realize was that the element of surprise had been completely lost. Japanese intelligence, through precise analysis of American reconnaissance flight patterns and radio traffic, had deduced with absolute accuracy that the landings would take place on the beaches of Miyazaki, Ariake, and Kushikino. They massed the bulk of their defensive forces in these exact areas, turning the sandy beaches into minefields and crossfire traps, utilizing the rugged mountainous terrain to dig complex, deep tunnel networks reinforced with concrete, capable of withstanding preliminary naval and aerial bombardment, from which Japanese forces would emerge the moment the shelling stopped to harvest American lives on the exposed beaches. The greatest danger awaiting the American fleet was not merely coastal artillery, but the kamikaze suicide air force, which was planning the largest attack in history. Unlike the sporadic attacks seen in the Battle of Okinawa, Japan had hoarded a secret fleet exceeding 10,000 suicide aircraft, hidden and camouflaged within caves, forests, and farms, far from the eyes of American reconnaissance planes. The plan was to launch these planes in massive human waves the moment the landing ships approached the coast, but with a new and terrifying tactic, ignoring the armored battleships and focusing entirely on the troop transports and unarmored supply ships, aiming to drown tens of thousands of American soldiers while they were still at sea, turning the ocean waters into a soup of blood and burning fuel. The aerial assault was not the only threat. The Japanese Navy had developed suicide naval units, including hundreds of Shinyo explosive speedboats, Kaiten midget submarines, and a special unit of Fukuryu suicide divers, wearing primitive diving suits and walking on the seabed, carrying mines fixed to long bamboo poles to blow out the bottoms of landing craft, making every meter of the sea and every wave hide certain death. Even assuming American forces managed by some military miracle to secure a foothold on the beaches of Kyushu, nature itself was hiding another secret weapon. Historical climate records tell us that on October 9, 1945, Typhoon Louise struck the region. It was a powerful category typhoon that caused widespread destruction to American bases in Okinawa in our actual timeline. However, in the invasion scenario, this typhoon would have struck the massed and crowded American invasion fleet, destroying the floating Mulberry harbors upon which the Army relied for supplies and wrecking hundreds of ships. This would have led to a logistical catastrophe, leaving the soldiers who had landed on the beaches completely isolated, without ammunition, food, or medicine for days, trapped between the raging sea behind them and the bloodthirsty Japanese army in front of them. This was the scenario General Douglas MacArthur feared more than anything else, as it meant Operation Olympic turning into a massacre, exceeding in horror any battle the Allies had fought in Europe. Facing these dark predictions, and with casualty estimates rising to astronomical figures that prompted the War Department to order the minting of 500,000 Purple Heart medals in anticipation of the dead and wounded, the American command began considering unconventional options to break the expected deadlock. Documents declassified decades later revealed that the United States was planning to launch large-scale chemical and biological warfare against Japan. Chief of Staff General George Marshall proposed using toxic mustard gas and phosgene, not only against military forces, but to pump them into the tunnel networks and caves where the Japanese were entrenched, to exterminate them by asphyxiation. American leaders considered that the use of gas, despite being internationally banned, was the lesser of two evils compared to losing hundreds of thousands of American soldiers in street fighting. There were also plans to destroy Japanese agricultural crops using chemical agents to starve the population into submission, which would have led to a massive famine killing millions of children and the elderly in a slow and painful death. But the most terrifying scenario, which remained kept secret for a long time, was the plan regarding the use of the atomic bomb as a tactical field weapon. Instead of the strategy of deterrence by bombing cities, military planners discussed the possibility of providing a stockpile of 7 to 15 small nuclear bombs to be used directly on the battlefield. The idea was to bombard Japanese defensive concentrations and command centers behind the beaches with focused nuclear strikes to open breaches in the defensive lines, after which American soldiers would advance through radiation-contaminated zones to occupy the ground, at a time when the long-term effects of radiation were not fully understood. This meant that tens of thousands of American soldiers who might have survived Japanese bullets would return home carrying silent death in their cells, to die later of cancer and mysterious diseases, not to mention the environmental contamination that would have rendered large parts of Japan uninhabitable for millennia. While the United States was sinking into the bloody quagmire of the South in Kyushu, another player was watching the scene from the north with greedy eyes: the Soviet Union. Under secret agreements at the Yalta Conference, Stalin pledged to enter the war against Japan 3 months after the defeat of Germany, which actually happened with the Red Army's invasion of Chinese Manchuria and the brutal crushing of the Japanese army there. However, in the scenario of a prolonged war and Japan's non-surrender, Soviet appetite would not have stopped at the Chinese border. Soviet plans were ready to execute an amphibious landing on Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan, exploiting the engagement of the main Japanese forces in the south, repelling the Americans. With the defensive vacuum in the north, Soviet forces would have swept through the northern island and advanced rapidly southward, repeating the scenes of rape, looting, and destruction witnessed in Berlin. This Soviet intervention would have transformed the war from a mere military conflict to defeat Japan into a frenzied geopolitical race between the two superpowers to control Japanese territory before the other side. By the spring of 1946, with forces depleted in the south and the Soviet advance in the north, the United States would have been forced to launch the second and final phase of the invasion, Operation Coronet, aiming to invade the Kanto Plain and the capital, Tokyo, directly. This attack would have been the largest military operation in human history, pushing 1 million American soldiers into a direct confrontation with what remained of the Imperial Army and the popular militias in the heart of the capital. The battle inside Tokyo would have turned into brutal urban warfare exceeding the destruction of Stalingrad. American forces would have been forced to destroy the city neighborhood by neighborhood, using flamethrowers and armored bulldozers to bury defenders alive under the rubble. Amidst this chaos, it was highly likely that Emperor Hirohito, considered a living god by his people, would be killed, either by American aerial bombardment or during the fighting. The death of the emperor would mean the collapse of the only central authority capable of issuing a surrender order, leading to the fragmentation of the Japanese army into independent factions and guerrilla groups refusing to lay down arms, continuing to fight in the mountains and forests for years, turning Japan into a failed state ruled by chaos and death. After 2 years of continuous fighting, and by 1947, the guns would finally fall silent. In this timeline, maps and documents indicate that the unified Japan we know historically would not have continued to exist. The new reality would have drawn entirely different borders, a divided nation under the control of the Soviets in the north and the Americans in the south. The documents of Operation Downfall describe a precise scenario in which the capital, Tokyo, would transform into a border city marked by checkpoints and barbed wire, becoming a direct point of friction between the eastern and western blocs, taking the place of Berlin in Europe. This scenario would have reshaped the balance of power in Asia and the Pacific for decades, creating a political and military reality entirely different from what was later recorded in history books. Thus, the files of this operation remain preserved in military archives as one of the largest invasion plans ever devised, but never executed. They are merely pages telling the story of an alternate path of history, a path that halted at the planning stage, remaining only a theoretical possibility studied in military academies, and a silent witness to how a single decision can change the shape of maps and the fate of nations.